Well, hello and welcome to the first Q&A with SJ. For those of you who are new to Love Light, I started Love Light as a group for bright and airy photographers because at the time I didn't have anywhere where I could go as a bright photographer that wasn't specific to film or a certain preset. So I felt very lonely. I felt like I didn't have a place that I could connect with other bright photographers who were interested in bright, airy photography unless we were shooting in the same with the same preset or in the same format. And so that's how Love Light started, and it's turned into such an amazing community. And I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad that we found you, and that we can actually just inspire each other and do this journey together. So I've started this Q&A with SJ just like as really simple little place to go for questions that you might have to do with the bright and airy photography style, because sometimes you can feel a little bit alone and trying to figure it out yourself. And so one of the questions that I got asked, and this is the first question we're going to kick off with, is how do you shoot light and airy photography style without overexposing the highlights? And I love this question because this, I think, is probably the most common pitfall for anyone starting out in bright and airy photography or transitioning from a darker photography to bright and airy photography, is overexposing the highlights. And that's because, well, it's for one of two reasons. One, the picture looks brighter in its final stage, so it's easy to assume that that is happening in camera, and definitely when you're shooting digitally that's not the case. The second reason is that when you're shooting film, yes, it does actually happen in camera. You do need to, when you're shooting film, you do need to overexpose the film, and that's what gives it that bright airy feel. And the bright airy feel was largely started by film photographers who were doing exactly this. They were experimenting with overexposing the film and getting this lovely hazy, dreamy feel to their pictures, this fairy tale kind of lightness and pastel colours. And so, yeah, that then has become this craze now that people love this style of photography. And, I definitely know from my clients absolutely love it and it stands out to them. So I definitely think it's a really worthwhile pursuit to explore this type of effect with photography. The problem is those of us who are shooting digitally, and I am a digital photographer too, that it works differently than film. You can't overexpose a digital camera like you would a film camera. With a film camera, you get these lovely creamy highlights. It's actually a lot more difficult to actually blow out a film picture. You can overexpose it and you still won't lose the detail in the highlights anywhere near as much as you would in digital. If you overexpose the picture in a digital camera, you will lose the highlights, and that you can't regain that, and that gives the picture an amateur look. So if you are overexposing your pictures in camera and then thinking, oh, the pictures look a bit amateur, that's probably why, because you're losing the detail in the highlights. And that's what happens when you overexpose in a digital camera. You lose the information that is in the highlights of that picture. So they just go white. They just go plain white. And even if you try and bring the exposure back down in your post-processing, that white block of non-information will stay there on the picture and it will just get more and more obvious. So I've had this in the past where, I've made a mistake and I've overexposed a picture and I can't actually reduce the exposure back down again, and without it starting to look like there's weird contrast between the highlights and the rest of the picture. It looks quite garish. There is one way you can quite often rescue a picture like that. If you've got caught out and you've made a mistake and you've overexposed your picture and you're still needing to deliver it, turn it into black and white. Most of the time you can get away with it. If you've overexposed a picture in digital, you can get away with it by just turning it into black and white, and nobody ever needs to know that you made a mistake. But generally you want to make sure that you're preserving the highlights in your digital pictures at all costs, like all costs. And that means that sometimes your picture in camera will be a lot darker than your final picture will be. I actually did give some examples in the free masterclass of, because I actually had a picture from a shoot where I'd overexposed it and then one that I'd exposed correctly. So if you want to have a look at that, go and sign up for the masterclass. The link will be, it's in the description on Instagram, and it's also in the description on the Facebook group as well. If not, you can go to www.sarahjaneethan.co.uk/lovelight, and you'll be able to sign up there. And I've got this free 1 hour masterclass, and in there I kind of go go through these common issues and even give you examples of my own work so that you can see the difference between an overexposed picture in digital and a well exposed picture, and how that then ends up looking in the final processing. And you can see that the overexposed picture, even though I was actually able to rescue that picture and bring it back, bring the exposure back in post-processing, I lost the creamy highlights that are very common when you're trying to emulate a film look. You need those creamy highlights, and you lose that if you overexpose the picture. So I actually had a scenario literally a couple of weeks ago where I was shooting the confetti shot, and the place that they wanted to do it and the place that made most sense in the venue, coming down the steps outside the orangery, there was incredibly harsh side light coming on them. So I was facing this situation where I was going to have really harsh highlights down one side and very strong shadows down the other side of them. Well, I mean, that is a joy to work with. If anybody doesn't understand British sarcasm, there is my British sarcasm. And so I just thought, right, what do I do now? Do I try and mess this up and try and like find another place to shoot where we're going to have better lighting? But there wasn't anywhere really where we could shoot that was much more different, because the light was very harsh and the grounds were very open, so there wasn't really a lot of places to hide. So in that scenario, there's only so far you can go to control things on a wedding day. So I decided, no, I'm just going to go with it, and what I'm going to do is expose for the highlights, and I can recover the shadows later. And that's the thing, you can't recover highlights later, but you can recover shadows later, especially that the better your camera is, the more able you are to recover the shadows later in your post-processing. So I exposed for the highlights in my picture, which meant that my picture was very, very dark in its raw format. I mean, it's like nothing like my work that I would like to present at all. But I knew in that scenario I didn't have a choice. That was the only thing I could do. So I did that. I exposed for the highlights, and then later in my post-processing I was able to bring the shadows back up again. I was even actually able to increase the exposure of the picture, but I didn't lose the highlights. It still kept that creamy feel in the highlights. So I was able to have this actually very pretty, very bright picture when actually the conditions had been horrifically dark and contrasted on the day. So what I'll do is I'll post the example of the before and after of that picture, so you can see my raw file that's straight out of camera, and you can see my post-processed picture afterwards to see that it is consistent with my work and it's in line with my bright, airy, soft pastel style. I'll post those both in the Facebook group. If you're not already a part of the Facebook group, go and head over to the Love Light Fine Art Community Facebook group. I also sent this out as the creative tip on the Love Light newsletter. Would that have been 2 weeks ago, I think. So I actually went through this challenge of exposing and the need to expose for the highlights even when you're in harsh lighting conditions, and I also sent these examples, this before and after, so that you could see for yourself. So if you're not a part of the Love Light newsletter, is that a tongue twister? The Love Light newsletter, again, head over to the sarahjaneethan.co.uk/lovelight through the links in Instagram or Facebook, and you can sign up for that masterclass. You will also immediately start receiving those monthly newsletters where we recap the podcast episodes and what we've learned. We even pick a photographer to watch who is probably definitely under the radar, but we're like, oh my goodness, these guys are better than us already, so keep an eye out for them. And we go through creative tips, and we also have SEO tips, so there's loads in that Love Light newsletter. So if you want to sign up for that, just sign up for the free masterclass and you will start getting those newsletters straight away. And I'll just check that I've covered everything I wanted to say. Yes, I have. So I hope that's helped. So know that if you wanted to shoot the bright and airy style, you absolutely have to, under all circumstances, preserve your highlights, expose for the highlights. Everything else can be redeemed later. If you lose your highlights, you cannot get them back. So that is my number one tip for you for shooting bright and airy without overexposing your picture.